When you think of ancient Egypt, what comes to mind? Probably massive pyramids, right? A powerful, unified empire. But, that's not always the whole picture. Today, we're going to peel back that layer and look at a time of serious division and struggle, the totally fascinating and often overlooked 10th dynasty. So, what happens when a great empire falls apart? It's a huge question, right? Because that classic image we have of one pharaoh ruling a totally united Egypt, well, it completely shatters during a time historians call the First Intermediate Period. And that's exactly where our story kicks off. Okay, so take a look at this. This map really shows you the heart of the problem. Egypt was, and I mean this literally, a kingdom split in two. Up in the north, you had the 10th dynasty ruling from their capital, Herakleopolis. But down south, a rival power was bubbling up in Thebes. So this wasn't one happy kingdom anymore. It was two, and they were locked in a massive struggle for control of the Nile. So to get our bearings, when are we talking about? This is happening right after the fall of the Old Kingdom, the guys who built the Great Pyramids. We're looking at a stretch from roughly 2160 to 2025 BCE. And during this time, it wasn't about stability or building giant monuments. No way. This era was all about uncertainty and, well, things falling apart. All right, let's get into the investigation. The big question is, who were these rulers? Trying to figure that out is a real historical puzzle. It's almost like we're on a hunt for these phantom pharaohs. And here's where it gets really tricky. Unlike the super famous pharaohs, the ones with giant temples and family trees a mile long, the records for the 10th dynasty are, well, they're barely there. Historians are basically detectives, working with tiny fragments and clues, trying to piece this whole story together from the shadows. Okay, clue number one. We've got these things called cartouches and syrinx. Think of them as the royal name tags at the time. They're the fancy frames that held a king's official name. So we find names like Keti or Merikare, but they're usually on little broken bits of stone. It's a lot like finding one really important puzzle piece, but you don't have the box cover to see what the final picture is supposed to be. Now for our second clue. What's super interesting is that even with all this chaos, these rulers were still clinging to the old symbols of power. They were using images like the Skaja. That's the symbol for a unified Egypt. So what does that tell us? It tells us that even though the kingdom was literally split in half, they were still putting it out there that they were the rightful rulers of the whole thing. So this all leads to a much bigger question, right? If you can't build massive pyramids and your kingdom is broken, how do you even rule? It's pretty clear this situation called for a totally different way of being a king. And the difference is just night and day. Think about the Old Kingdom, an empire of monuments run by this huge centralized government. The 10th dynasty? No. This was a kingdom of survival. Power wasn't in one central place anymore, it was local. And the main goal wasn't building something huge for the history books, it was just keeping the lights on, making sure communities could actually function day to day. So how'd they pull it off? Pure pragmatism. It was all about what works. They gave more power to local governors, they were called nomarchs, to basically manage their own areas. They made sure the local offices, the bureaucracy, kept running. They used simple tools like seals and labels to keep track of goods. It was all about focusing on what was real and right in front of them, regional trade and whatever the Nile could provide. This was government from the ground up. And their building projects? They totally reflected this new reality. So forget about pyramids, we're talking smaller, local monuments and tombs. But don't let their size fool you. These small stones were making some really loud claims. They were still powerful political statements. Every single little inscription was a way of saying, hey, I'm in charge here, trying to prove they were legitimate in a world that was falling apart. But just surviving, that was never going to be enough. The 10th dynasty was caught in a constant power struggle that basically defined their entire time on the throne. It really was a tale of two competing centers of power. And their number one rival? The city of Thebes, down in the south. So, while the 10th dynasty is ruling from Herakleopolis up north, these really ambitious rulers from what we call the 11th dynasty are gathering strength in Thebes, and they're getting ready to make a play for the whole country. Now, this wasn't some quick, decisive war. Not at all. It was this long, drawn-out conflict that would flare up and die down. Fortunes were always shifting. For decades, these two powers just battled it out for supremacy. Towns and territories would change hands constantly. This back-and-forth rivalry, that's the central drama of this entire period. Spoiler alert, in the end, the 10th dynasty lost that fight. But that's not where their story ends. Not by a long shot. They left behind something else, a totally different kind of legacy. It's our final clue, and it gives us this incredible window into their world. And here it is. It comes to us in a piece of literature called The Teachings for King Menkare. What is it? Well, it's basically an instruction manual, supposedly written by a king for his son who's about to take over. And for us, it is the most direct look we have into the mind of a ruler living through these crazy fragmented times. Yeah, words for rule in troubled times. That just perfectly sums it up. This isn't some brag sheet about battles won or temples built. It's real, practical advice. It's a philosophical guide on how to be a good, effective king when everything around you is in chaos. And what's so amazing about this is that this dynasty, which we might think of as unsuccessful, left behind a blueprint for how to be a king that's based on wisdom and justice, not just raw power. This text shows a level of deep thought, a concern for how you should rule that might just be their most unique and lasting contribution. So that leaves us with a final thought to chew on, the 10th dynasty. They didn't build pyramids that scrape the sky. What they left behind were words, advice, guidance that has survived for 4,000 years. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What's a more powerful legacy in the end? A giant monument made of stone or wisdom that can actually outlast an entire empire?